the fall of Syria, the lightning collapse of the Syrian government. Now, all of Syria's, the Syrian military's heavy assets are under attack by the Israeli military. Not very shocking, honestly. And HTS, the Al-Qaeda rebrand, backed by Turkey, basically a Turkish proxy, which makes it a NATO proxy, has stormed into Damascus along with an assortment of armed gangs with regime forces, pretty much anyone aligned with the Syrian government, fleeing in a fairly orderly departure so far. So I don't know, we could start with a scene of, actually, I don't want to start with that. I was going to start with Jolani entering the Umayyad Mosque, but I think let's take a look at a scene from yesterday in Damascus of what it looked like in the streets. This is what's being framed as liberation. It's basically, start over. I mean, and this is the true spirit of the opposition forces that had been fighting the Syrian government and its allies for the past 12 years or so. They're not waving the FSA flag with 3 stars. These are the best fighters. These are the ones equipped by Turkey. These are the ones who have been really on the front lines. When the FSA really just functioned as a weapons farm for them. And now they're in Damascus, where the Syrian central bank is being looted. Another hopeful scene for Syria. I'm being sarcastic. Here's the looting of the central bank. It looks kind of like Damascus in 2003 when the Iraqi state assets were looted, when Iraqi antiquities museums, Baghdad in 2003, when museums were looted and the antiquities were sold off to wealthy buyers on the black market. And this is what we're being told is liberation. Meanwhile, someone who is a real supporter of the Syrian people for a long time, one of the Syrian people's greatest advocates, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, has taken credit.
This is a historic day for the Middle East. The collapse of the Assad regime,
in English,
tyranny in Damascus, offers great opportunity, but also is fraught with significant dangers. This collapse is a direct result of our forceful action against Hezbollah and Iran, Assad's main supporters. It set off a chain reaction of all those who want to free themselves from this tyranny and its oppression. But it also means we have to take action against possible threats. One of them is the collapse of the Separation of Forces Agreement from 1974 between Israel and Syria. This agreement held for 50 years. Last night it collapsed. The Syrian army abandoned its positions. We gave the Israeli army the order to take over these positions to ensure that no hostile force embeds itself right next to the border of Israel.
So Netanyahu authorized an invasion of the Syrian non-occupied side of the Syrian occupied Golan Heights, as well as military action against Syria. So, Aaron, what are your initial thoughts here on the transition taking place in Syria?
Well, just one point on Israel. So Israel's already occupied a landmass larger than Gaza inside Syria. And that includes Mount Hermon, which I believe is the highest point in Syria. Looks directly down at Damascus. And, you know, if we know Israel, that's a territory they're not going to give up because they've already taken Syria's Golan Heights. So Israel's taking advantage of this by consolidating its theft of Syrian land. And just to, you know, make sure that any possible future resistance to it is destroyed, it's undergone a massive bombing campaign, bombing areas across Syria, the port of Latakia, facilities in Damascus, Syrian military zones. it's completely wiping out any possibility that one day Syria might be involved in a military action to get its territory back. So basically, Israel has cemented its theft of Syrian territory tonight, and it's taking and that, of course, is a major reason why we've had this dirty war for the last decade, and that's the point I want to focus on. Like, so many people, and there are many people in Syria who've lived under Assad, who hated that government, suffered under it, had plenty of grievances against it. My concern as a Westerner is what was our role in the country, and do we have the right to spend billions of dollars arming an insurgency dominated by Al-Qaeda and their allies, imposing sanctions that hollowed out what was left of Syria and prevented it from rebuilding, and having a military occupation that stole Syria's oil and wheat? And without all of these things, without this, unprecedented foreign intervention from the U.S. and its allies, we wouldn't be seeing the former leader of Al-Qaeda in Syria now toppling the government today. That's just a fact. And a major goal of this dirty war was had zero to do with authoritarianism or spreading democracy, had to do with undermining a key member of the axis of resistance, as Netanyahu is openly saying. I mean, he's saying that this weakens Hezbollah, and he's right. Hezbollah is the major fighting force in the region that resists Israeli aggression. And so the joint U.S.-Israeli goal, which was laid out early on, there's WikiLeaks documents where U.S. officials, including Hillary Clinton, talk about this, about how if we topple Assad, it will undermine the axis of resistance. So that has taken a huge step forward with the toppling of the Syrian government.
Absolutely. And, just 2 months ago in Idlib, the Syrian opposition, which had been holed up there in this Turkish NATO protectorate, was celebrating the Israeli murder of the most consequential resistance figure in the region, the leader of the only group that was one of the only groups that was materially resisting Israel. While the HTS forces in Idlib and Turkey and the Turkish military sat back and did nothing, while Erdogan sold oil and gas to Israel through Azerbaijan. The celebration in Idlib. Killing Hassan Nasrallah in October. And this is this has, by the way, it's footage from Enab Baladi, which was funded by the U.S. government and the National Endowment for Democracy to propagandize for the quote-unquote Syrian revolution. And this was what helped lead to the decision of HTS and its Turkish masters to launch an offensive, because they saw that Hezbollah was being weakened by Israel and that they wanted to participate in the destruction of the axis of resistance, whose key beneficiary would be Israel and Western Empire. And what is their mentality? What is driving them? Sectarianism. Not much else. They're mad that Nasrallah and Hezbollah prevented the collapse of the Syrian state, along with other allies of Damascus years ago. And 2 months later, they succeeded and have clearly credited Israel. So Netanyahu is right. What he said standing on the Golan Heights was correct, that without Israel, this quote-unquote liberation would have been impossible. And therefore, Netanyahu is setting the agenda of what liberation looks like. And what is he doing? Destroying any remaining military asset belonging to Syria that could have not effectively, I mean, it never was capable of it, but somewhat deterred Israeli and U.S. aggression. And this is, helicopters, the Syrian Air Force, Syrian air defenses are being completely destroyed after the Syrian so-called rebels worked to destroy them throughout 2013 and 2014, making it easier for Israel to carry out hundreds of bombings a year. And so what you have is liberation without sovereignty, liberation without the capacity to resist those who have been seeking to destroy any iteration of Arab independence and specifically of the Palestinian struggle. Who could have predicted this? It was almost impossible to predict. I mean, we never would have thought that after 12 years in which we saw Israel arming, equipping Syrian FSA forces in the Golan. Sorry, my phone, whenever I say Syria, it activates. If that we could have never imagined that Israel would have taken the cue. Why were they arming and equipping them? Why were they supporting them? Why was the U.S. pumping one out of every $13 in the CIA's black budget into supporting these forces? Well, we're seeing it right now to destroy the last bastion of sovereignty of any Arab state. And obviously there's a lot of blame to go around. You can't just blame. I mean, there's internal blame, but as you said, Aaron, I live in the West. I live in the US. I saw my own government do this. None of this would have been possible without Netanyahu, without the Caesar sanctions, without Operation Timber Sycamore, without the Incirlik air base in Turkey, backed by NATO, supplying not just Al-Qaeda, but ISIS, and the theft of Syrian oil and Syrian assets. And so we're seeing the last remnants of the Syrian state sovereignty being destroyed, including Syrian government buildings in like shock and awe Israeli attacks.
Yeah. And it's not just Netanyahu taking credit. It's Joe Biden as well. This is what he said.
The upshot for all this is, for the first time ever, neither Russia nor Iran nor Hezbollah could defend this abhorrent regime in Syria. And this is a direct result of the blows that Ukraine, Israel have delivered upon their own self-defense with unflagging support of the United States.
So you hear that? Because of the unflagging support of the U.S. to its allies in Ukraine and in Israel, Syria's allies were weakened and couldn't defend it from collapse. So he's openly taking credit as well. And of course, he didn't mention the dirty war that his administration under Obama started, where they spent, as you mentioned, billions of dollars arming an insurgency that they knew was dominated by Al-Qaeda. That's why Jake Sullivan wrote privately, Al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria. Yeah. But he did actually in that speech go on to mention the U.S. sanctions and the U.S. military occupation, which did further decimate Syria. And these sanctions were designed to prevent reconstruction and to hurt ordinary Syrians. And this is the standard U.S. playbook. You make a population suffer enough, eventually the state becomes destroyed. People's will to resist gets sapped and everything crumbles. And, you know, it's on the back of that al-Jilani, the former leader of Al-Qaeda in Syria, you know, now under a new name, HTS, has ridden into Damascus. And I mean, no matter what you think about Assad, that, you know, as Westerners, that's the crucial background that we're responsible for. And nobody in Syria voted for the sanctions. Nobody voted for the CIA to be, you know, ferrying weapons to Al-Qaeda and people fighting with them. Nobody voted for the U.S. military occupation. And that's the form of authoritarianism in Syria that the world is just supposed to accept. Outside powers spending all the resources they have to destroy a much weaker country.
The only people who voted for the sanctions, which immiserated Syria and sapped the will of anyone to fight back, was Congress. A Congress where almost every member is funded by AIPAC. A Congress that was subjected to a massive PSYOP sponsored by the CIA and Qatar called the Caesar Files, which, you know, have been exposed by others like Rick Sterling. No one has actually looked at them. Elliot Engel was the one who brought this before Congress. And you had this guy show up in a blue suit as Caesar, the supposed whistleblower, looking like a faceless Smurf from another planet, because we're not supposed to know his identity, which means we can't verify who he is. He was supposedly a military photographer. And guess who his translator was? It was Muaz Mustafa, the guy who brought John McCain inside Syria on his notorious 2013 trip to meet with bandits who had kidnapped Shia pilgrims and clamor for the destruction of Syria by the U.S. Air Force. Muaz Mustafa, whose Syrian Emergency Task Force is funded wholly by the US government, who works with the Pentagon directly now, who's basically a State Department asset. And the photographs showed lots of dead people in mortuaries. But as even Human Rights Watch, run by Regime Change Roth, Ken Roth, acknowledged in a small footnote, at least 50% of those shown in the photos were Syrian loyalists or people who were killed in ordinary incidents like car accidents. These were people who had been most largely killed in combat. And we were just sold these photos as the new Holocaust. It's always never again. Everything is based, whether it's Rwanda or Syria or Libya, it's always the never again narrative. And it's always to generate human misery. And what did the Caesar sanctions lead to? Massive food insecurity for like 80 to 90% of the Syrian population, severing of the Syrian central bank from the world economy because they couldn't trade in dollars. No one could function anymore. So it was only a matter of time before the Syrian state collapsed under that kind of economic pressure. And we'll be talking about that more. But this, deception after deception after deception, and everyone believed in it. All the pro-Palestine influencers who were out there cheering for this liberation didn't ever examine this. They didn't examine the Duma deception. They didn't examine any of the deceptions. They basically would have believed in Kony 2012 if it happened today.